All right. Well, it's a pleasure to have with us Larry Lohmann to talk a little bit about his recent article, really an interesting article called "White Climate, White Energy." And we're going to get him he's in Ecuador, and we're going to get him to reflect a little bit about the situation in Ecuador as well, movements on the ground in Ecuador, and his work on his important work at the Corner House. So thanks for agreeing to talk with us, Larry.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
So just to start the conversation, we were really impressed with this recent article of yours called "White Climate, White Energy." If you could share with people a little bit what the main argument you're making in that important article.
Yeah, well, the article really drew on years and decades of sort of frustration and puzzlement about where the climate movements are going and where the energy movements are going. I mean, a lot of the climate movement, as you know, has been dominated since for decades by largely by white middle class, well-intentioned people who take their cue from the warnings that climatologists have been giving for years about the state of the climate, as they define it. And similarly, a lot of the movement around fossil fuels and energy alternatives and energy transitions has just as the dominant white middle class climate movements have taken for granted the picture of climate that is presented to us by climatology, official climatology, which is quite a recent scientific invention. So too the energy movements, the energy alternatives, the energy transition, the New Green Deal, all of these movements have tended to take for granted the picture of energy that has come down to us from the 19th century science of thermodynamics, which was originated and which developed the modern concept of energy, the concept that we use today, at a time of imperialism, at a time of rampant industrialization of capitalism and the mechanization of labor and the use of machines, fossil-powered machines, as a way of disciplining labor and as a way of concentrating labor and as a way of making labor more productive. And it's no accident that our concept of energy comes from this time. It comes from this time of imperialism, racism, of rampant racism, colonialism, and the brutal beginnings of an industrial capitalism that continues today, and also, of course, patriarchal. I mean, in my presentations, I always like to show slides of the inventors of the concept of energy, basically these 19th century physicists, many of whom were businessmen, many of whom were capitalists, many of whom were, imperialists. And if you look at their faces, it's not too much of a straight, you don't need to explain too much about their patriarchal point of view either, because it just communicates itself. You get the picture just by putting thermodynamics, which is how energy, our concept of energy started, very visually puts that concept of thermodynamics and by implication, the concept of energy in that historical and political context. And it's no accident that energy was born at that time, in those places and with those people. I have to apologize for my computer. It's a bit old and probably
that's okay. That's
turning
okay.
various things off.
We lost your picture for a second there, but we continue to listen to your words. So
yeah. That's good. Well, I'll just keep turning on the picture when it turns off and hope for the best.
That's okay.
This is something that's been sort of bubbling over for a time, and it's combined with the fact that many of my colleagues who work in environmental and social movements in the global South, and many people of color and feminists in the global North as well, have long felt a sort of unease and frustration at what I call the whiteness of, the climate movement and the whiteness of the energy movements, including the Green New Deal and all of those supposedly, non-racist, non-patriarchal energy alternatives. And it's been difficult to articulate, what is the problem with this? Why is it that this picture of climate and this picture of energy don't speak to us? Why does there seem to be such a disconnect between, the official, white middle class climate movement, the official white middle class energy movements, and movements on the ground? For example, movements against, industrial tree plantations, or movements against extractivism, or movements against, land seizures, or movements against, violation of indigenous rights. What's the problem here? It seems difficult to make a connection between all these movements, and that was also part of the frustration. So, some of my, explorations this year about white climate and white energy are just attempts to put those things together to instead of simply, taking energy for granted and taking the climate as defined by official climatology for granted, to see if maybe there's a way of connecting movements that can be helped by putting together, this frustration that people feel about the whiteness of these movements and the actual whiteness of the concepts that they work with.
Can I ask you just to elaborate a little further, because in the social sciences, there is an increasing call to decolonize the theoretical conceptual frameworks that we're using. And it sounds like what you're saying is that the same kind of impulse towards decolonization of our theoretical frameworks in the social sciences would be fruitfully employed to thinking through the basic concepts of climate science even. So, which is something that people often are willing to go with the decolonization of the social sciences, but are a little bit more, let's say, reticent to accept the idea that natural sciences too could be subject to a process of decolonization.
Yeah, and that's exactly the sort of target I was aiming at, and the sort of the slight gap I was trying to help fill here. Is I think people, people go a certain distance in, as you say, trying to decolonize social science concepts, or any even basic concepts from the 1960s or 50s, like development. And, people are trying to apply a decolonizing lens to these concepts, but people often draw back when they come up against a concept like energy or a concept like the climate. And that's understandable, because the ruling hegemony has been that these things are different. The concepts of science, like natural science, like energy and climate, are different somehow. They don't have any historical context. They're just sort of realities out there, which this special priesthood, disinterested priesthood, has put us in touch with through their pipeline of the scientific method. And I think it's really important for social movements to challenge this, because there is no such thing as these concepts that don't have any historical context and don't have any political baggage. And so what I'm trying to do this year is and many other people are trying to do it as well. I mean, I mentioned some of my presentations. I mentioned, for example, Kara Daggett, the scholar of energy, who's written a recent book on the development of the energy concept in the 19th century, and of course, friends like Andreas Malm and Jason Moore, who are very very intent on looking at the historical roots of machines and historical roots of fossil fuel and global warming in the 19th century. And of course, goes back much further than that as well. But I think there's still, especially among a lot of white middle class movements, there's a real defensiveness, a real reluctance to sort of go all the way with the decolonizing agenda and look at these concepts themselves. So what I'm trying to do this year is together with many colleagues, is trying to trying to flesh that out a bit and try to make it more of a common sense idea that energy is in fact a white concept. It is a racialized concept. It is a colonial concept, and the same with global warming. I mean, the approach has to be different in those two fields because climatology is different from thermodynamics. But I think you apply the same. I mean, I'm trying to apply the same general approach. Maybe I should try to say a few words about each of them.
Yeah.
Each of them separately, and how you can make it common sense that these concepts actually need to be interrogated themselves if we're going to have any way of joining together social movements and strengthening climate and energy movements. Maybe start with climatology. I mean, climatology is quite a recent development. It's more or less, I suppose, more or less a 20th century development, but the way it's developed is to encourage a focus on carbon dioxide molecules or greenhouse gas molecules as the cause of climate change. And I often cite an interview with one of the iconic climatologists of our time, Sir John Houghton, who was one of the founding members of the IPCC, the official scientific panel of the UN on climate change. Where he says that, we can't talk about fossil fuels. I mean, he wouldn't even dream of mentioning colonialism, but even fossil fuels you can't talk about when you're talking about climate, much less imperialism or patriarchy, because this isn't science. Why isn't that science? Well, he explained that, climate change happens when carbon dioxide molecules cross the border into the atmosphere. And therefore, that's the cause of climate change. And therefore, if we're going to do anything about it, it follows, we have to establish some kind of border controls on carbon dioxide molecules.
Yeah, it begins to sound very familiar to certain political rhetoric we have about border controls.
Precisely. I mean, you don't need to look very far to see the parallels. I mean, the idea is that if the problem is too many carbon dioxide molecules in a certain part of our physical system, i.e. the atmosphere, then what we need to do is to find managers or some sort of, controls to keep the carbon dioxide molecules from crossing that border. It's like building Trump's wall, obviously, across
the climate border patrol, border patrol.
And this will solve all our problems. Or if in fact a few of those carbon dioxide molecules do get across the border, then what we need to do is capture them, imprison them, for example, put them in trees, put them underground, so they don't get out and contaminate our wonderful society or our wonderful atmosphere. And the parallels are very, very strict here. I mean, so you can no more, inquire into why, this pattern of carbon dioxide molecules crossing the border into our atmosphere. Why that you can't ask why that happens within climatology any more than a Donald Trump appointee can ask why someone might get on the train in Guatemala to try to reach the Rio Grande to cross the border. You can't ask that question because it's not science. It's not relevant. We have to stop these immigrants. That's the thing. We have to stop the carbon dioxide molecules. That's the key. That's the core. And anything else is just and obviously the parallels go much further than that. I mean, just as you're not going to solve, the problems of capitalism, including the problems of workers in North America who are, being more and more brutalized by establishing immigration controls at the border. Also, you're not going to solve the climate problem by trying to appoint imaginary impotent sort of police and managers at the border who are somehow going to be able to take it upon themselves to, exclude all of these alien, vicious carbon dioxide molecules from contaminating our ideal society. And of course, the picture of the ideal society and the ideal atmosphere are also parallel. we've known since, the Nazi era and long before that, this idea of, finding the scapegoat and blaming the scapegoat goes hand in hand with the idea of, this idealized, harmonious, society that would work just fine if it wasn't contaminated by these horrible aliens. I mean, Zizek talks a lot about this. Many people talk about that. And actually, if you look at it, the climatology is actually committed to the same general picture. And I mean, none of this is to say that, the climatology is false, or that, what they say about, the global warming or the greenhouse effect is false. No, it's not. It's not to say that. It's to say that there's a certain image here that prevents the actual, that by defining climate as this sort of idealized, uncontaminated atmosphere, which will be stable if we just preserve it against these aliens. Then, there's a strong parallel there, and a very, it's a very counterproductive picture if you're actually trying to do something. So if you define climate that way, then therefore you define, climate science as something which is only about border controls of carbon dioxide molecules, or homeland security, taking custody of these carbon dioxide molecules, and you exclude the whole history of, why do we have fossil fuels? Why did capital turn to fossil fuels? Why did they turn to machines to control labor? What actually caused this whole thing to be set in motion? People like Andreas Malm, are people you can turn to understand that. And so I think, once you start interrogating this, you have to start interrogating the very idea of climate that we work with. And you have to start interrogating the idea that, well, climate science can't talk about imperialism. It can't talk about patriarchy. It can't talk about extractivism. All it can talk about is, the movements of immigrants, because that, it's not really a scientific concept. And the idea that the climatologists are being scientific, and the anti-colonialists are not being scientific, just doesn't hold water. We're not criticizing, we're not saying the science is false. We're saying we have to understand what it is. What is this science? What is this climate?
Put it into a broader historical context, to understand also the emergence of these concepts, where they come from. So this is, in a sense, that's a more scientific approach.
I would argue that, yeah, and I think, it's just a way of opening up science to more scientific criticism, to more of the constructive kind of, it's not rejecting science that we have to run away from climatology. Oh no, we can't talk about. No, it's a way, it's just like, in dealing with our own whiteness and our own white history, the idea is not to run away from it and say, oh, well, we don't want to be white. The idea is to face it and to try to come to terms with it in a constructive way, that it can allow us to sort of, get together more as movements, and to make climate scientists more a part of movements by opening out the dialogue, and sort of trying to get rid of some of these taboos about, what is science and what isn't science, and so forth. And I think that's actually a very constructive building move. But of course, it does face entrenched, resistance, as all kinds of anti-colonialist thinking and movements do.
So this is a very powerful critique of the parameters, let's say, of climatology. But you said you also wanted to speak about thermodynamics?
Yeah, I think you can do a parallel critique, and I hope a critique which is constructive in a parallel way of energy science. I mentioned earlier that thermodynamics, from which we get our modern concept of energy, has a certain history. Before 1800, nobody talked about energy in the modern sense. People had all sorts of meanings for the word energy, which go back to ancient Greece and so forth, and also to many indigenous societies in Latin America, Africa, and so forth, all sorts of concepts of energy. But the concept of energy that most energy movements today use, including Green New Deal movements and so forth, is derived from this very parochial 19th century physics of thermodynamics, the first and second law of thermodynamics in particular. And, you know, sorry, my computer's in the blink again. I have to try to get the
That's
power
okay.
established. Yeah, I think it's better now.
All right, good.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you put this energy concept in this context, you find yourself interrogating you go all the way down into the very concept of energy itself, and especially the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And I mean, one of the it's convenient to sort of divide them up that way. I mean, in a sense, the first law of thermodynamics, which is usually known today as the conservation of energy, it's also a way of commensurating. It's also a way of putting together many different activities and many different things that people had never put together before. There's a famous historian in the US who said that before the 19th century, people would not have imagined that, a horse pulling a plow and, lightning in the sky and a stream running down the hill are instances of the same thing. Nobody would have thought they were all energy. Nobody would have dreamed of that, much less, fossil fuels being the same thing as the wind powering sailing ships and so forth. But the first law of thermodynamics enabled people to put that together in a very practical way. And of course, it wasn't only the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics goes together with an entire imperialist structure of commensurating different kinds of energy. You had the coal-fired machines, coal-fired transportation, coal-fired factory machines. Coming up, you had all sorts of other kinds of conversion engines, which is the technical term, for transforming one kind of what became known as energy into another kind of what became known as energy. All of these things were key to mechanization, the mechanization of labor and the control of labor, and also key to imperialist expansion, which in turn fed the whole process more. So, all of these things were, electricity was transformed into mechanical energy, was transformed into electricity, all sorts of different kinds of, heat was transformed into kinetic energy, all of these different transformations. It wasn't only happening on a blackboard, it's somewhere where somebody was explaining the first law of thermodynamics. It was happening in the real world where all of these things were being made equivalent in a very practical way. And all of these things were put into a particular hierarchy, which said that the most important thing is this abstract energy, which links all of these things together. And, oil is an instance of this, coal is an instance of this, electricity, batteries, all of these things are instances of. So, a community, for example, that tried to preserve, a perennial stream for its subsistence, or just somebody in their kitchen who was trying to preserve, community forest as a source of wood for, cooking. All of these things were subordinated. These things came underneath the big E energy, the abstract energy. They became subordinated to that. And they said, okay, yeah, all these things are very well, but what we need is this abstract energy, which was personified as a sort of fuel, fossil fuel in particular. And all of the other energies are just little subsets of that. And so we can basically wipe out all of those other little energies and their myriad connections with different kinds of subsistence in the service of aggregating it all and accumulating it all into a big abstract body of energy, which we can then use for whatever industrial capitalist purposes we want to. So this hierarchy was established implicitly, not only by the first law of thermodynamics, but also by what was happening in the real world at the same, at the same time, which was the practical commensuration of all of these kinds of energy through dynamos, through coal-fired, steam engines, through internal combustion engines, through batteries and electricity grids and all of these things. And the second law of thermodynamics, as my friend George Kafentzis puts it very well, addressed this issue as well. But whereas the first law of thermodynamics instilled in capitalism this huge optimism about we can subordinate all of these forms of subsistence into a massive, big, abstract energy, which we can then harness, for our purposes. That gave, that made capital euphoric, that whole vision of energy, that new vision of energy. But the second law of thermodynamics, as George Kafentzis says, it was a little bit, it laced this high with arsenic, in his words, because it said, well, actually, there's a bit of a problem, is that the more conversion engines you have, the more you assemble this giant abstract energy, at the top of the hierarchy, the less usable energy in that sense you're actually going to have, because once you use energy to do work, you can't use it again to do the same work. Once you burn coal into ash and carbon dioxide, you can't turn around and then reassemble the ash and carbon dioxide back into coal and use it again without a huge expenditure of energy. In fact, it's so impossible. I mean, nobody even dreams of doing that kind of thing, because there is no perpetual motion machine, which was capital's always had this sort of, love-hate fascination with perpetual motion machines as a way of, eliminating labor on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's impossible. You can't have perpetual motion machines. There's a one-way, the more you try to harness, the more fossil fuels you take out of the ground, the more dams you build. The more of these sort of first law of thermodynamics type of conversions you accomplish, the bigger problems you have, because you have these accumulations of waste, you have these accumulations of unusable energy, of useless energy that cannot be used for work. You have to find people to clean it up. You have to keep seeking new sources of negative entropy, which is the second law of thermodynamics way of putting it. You have to seek new forms of high quality energy, because there's a one-way trip from high quality energy to low quality energy. And once you've made the energy low quality, what the two laws of thermodynamics together suggest and excuse and sort of propose as a natural order of things is that, well, we have this landscape where, we're constantly looking for high quality energy or low entropy energy that can be used for work. And we're constantly looking for more and more. We have to look for high quality energy underground, taking fossil fuels out of the ground. We have to dam the rivers, and never mind if the dams fill up with silt, eventually, never mind that the waterfalls are eroded away eventually, still we have to do this. And at the same time, it's a natural order of things that more and more waste is going to be built up, and we have to find more and more slaves to sort of clean it up and get it out of the way, and more slaves to find new sources of high quality energy. So thermodynamics, and by implication, our modern concept of energy, sort of establish this as the natural order of things. This is the universe. This is what we have to do. And, this is not to say that the first law and the second law are not true. They are true, absolutely true. But in a way, their hegemony or their dominance today reflects the same old capitalist contradictions and the same old capitalist imperatives. So what I suggest with energy is more or less the same thing I suggest with climatology. Not that we reject thermodynamics, not at all, but that we put it in its political context and see it for what it is, and understand it scientifically for what it is, rather than mystifying it as a sort of order of the universe. And, you know, I'm hoping that this in some distant way chimes with, you know, for example, many indigenous understandings of energy. And I hope Marxist understandings, maybe sometime in the future, Marxist understandings that can accept that, you know, these types of enclosure of the commons, these types of, you know, commensuration of you know, the ordinary little energies of subsistence, which no one ever called, you know, by the name of thermodynamic energy. You know, these are assimilated into capital, and to look at this and to look at thermodynamics as a way of describing this process and offering a true description of this process, but, you know, as something which should not be taken as the last word about, you know, what humanity wants. You know, I think this analysis, one of the good points of this analysis maybe, is that it militates this idea is that, you know, well, human beings have always wanted, you know, energy and more energy, and, you know, they need energy, and we need a Green New Deal to supply them with you know, energy which doesn't have all these drawbacks. No, that's not enough. You have to look at the concept of energy itself, and we're seeing this in a very practical form in terms of the controversy today about, you know, renewable energy. You know, it's becoming, I think it was always obvious to many social movements on the ground in the global South that, you know, turning to renewable energy is not a way out of this problem of capital, which thermodynamics describes very well, of the fact that you know, you're not going to escape the problem of the second law of thermodynamics by suddenly, you know, opening lithium mines in Bolivia and Chile and Argentina and so forth, and opening cobalt mines in Congo and building all sorts of, you know, renewable energy technology, because you're doing the same thing. You're building your future on a one-way extractivism. You're building a future on all of the racism and the colonialism that includes. And you can't escape into this sort of magic universe, you know, in which the second law of thermodynamics doesn't apply. So you have to question that, you have to question the whole idea of abstract energy, of thermodynamic energy, of 19th century imperialist energy, and ask, is this really the energy that humanity has always wanted since time immemorial? Well, no, it isn't. It's not, and that's just a historical fact, and it's a fact of present history as well. You know, anybody who resists the commensuration of their subsistence, the streams that they defend, the you know, the natural cycles that they defend, anybody that, you know, is defending that is in fact already engaged in a kind of often undescribed resistance to the dominance of abstract thermodynamic energy. People are actually, you and I are resisting, whether we know it or not, this thermodynamic, the dominance of this thermodynamic energy, this abstract energy every day, whenever we, you know, defend our cooking against, you know, being taken over by energy industries, or our community forest from being taken over in order to build a dam to feed the need for abstracting. You know, there's resistance is everywhere, and I think it's a question of recognizing it and recognizing that we have to question the whole concept of energy itself and what it is and who has defined it and why, in order to go forward and to build movements, for example, between people who are concerned about you know, the energy future of industrialized countries and people who are trying to defend, you know, their own futures on the ground in rural areas in the global South.
So this seems to me a really important connection then between the sort of conceptual critique of the basic concepts in climatology or in thermodynamics, a contextualization on the one hand, and then the opening it up to this kind of historical understanding. And on the other hand, building bridges with different kinds of social movements. You say, in one hand, indigenous movements. On another hand, you talked about anti-capitalist movements. On another hand, you could talk about feminist movements. And so could you just explain a little bit more about how the conceptual critique opens up the terrain or create space for movement building?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm unable to divide actually the conceptual critique from the movement critique. I think it's just a question of discussing
Mm,
it more and elaborating it more and getting people to talk about it more. So it's not, I mean, they are linked. They are linked to begin with, I think, the
mm,
conceptual critique and the movement critique. And I think you see this often when different movements get together and they recognize themselves in each other, and they recognize themselves in what they're doing. I mean, um, I've only personally been working with this, this idea of white climate and white energy for, a very short time, just as one more experimental way to try to get these kind of dialogues going. And I've been helped a lot by the response I've gotten from just well, I mean, I haven't been doing it for very long, but there's this response from people who are active in indigenous movements and
mm.
movements in the global south and energy and climate, say, oh, yeah, this is one way of saying,
Articulating what we were saying.
yeah, or just saying in a different way, what our problem is in getting together, northern movements and southern movements, and what the problem is, the frustration that indigenous movements are always expressing with the white movements of, yeah, you don't get it, you just don't, you just don't understand. I mean, one of my indigenous colleagues said that, yeah, it's useful to talk about it in this way because, you're sort of, as a white person with this, looking at science closely and these 19th century, 20th century sciences closely, you're sort of, you're working at it from a different direction from us, but we're, it's a direction which is useful. It's useful because you're coming from within, you're coming from within your whiteness and looking at it that way, whereas we are coming at it from a different direction, but it's it's a
Convergent
way
somehow.
to enriching the dialogue and moving it forward to a new point where maybe people can get together more.
Mm, mm. So, so very interesting discussion. Thank you very much for that. People in Peace in Kurdistan are quite interested in this question of indigenous movements and possible affinities with and solidarity with indigenous movements. You're in Ecuador. Could you say a couple of things about how the indigenous movement is approaching a lot of these issues in Ecuador?
Yeah, the indigenous movements here in Ecuador, as well as in some other countries, have been very become very powerful since the 1990s. I think in Ecuador in particular. I mean, a very important political force, and that's not only because self-identified indigenous people constitute maybe 30% of the population, and the mestizo population is just basically everywhere. I mean, partly, I suppose you could call it partly indigenous population, but it's not only for that reason that it's become very powerful. It's also because building on a long tradition of indigenous mobilization in Ecuador in the 1990s, it just things began to come together, and they became a really potent political force. And a lot of that force has been directed against extractivism, and oil extractivism is especially important in Ecuador since the 1960s or so forth. Devastation of indigenous communities, but also mining, hard rock mining, things like gold and so forth have been a very important focus point for indigenous movements here, and also water, which is very important in feeding a lot of the mining industry, and the seizure of water and the contamination of water. All of these kinds of enclosure have been very, very important in the indigenous movement here, and never separated from the idea of indigenous autonomy, of plurinationality, the idea that you're not going to be able to, put all these things together. The dialogue is a matter of plural nations, not a question of total state power and homogenization and so forth, and language rights, for example, and all of those things, these are all inseparable in the indigenous movements here. You can't separate the extractivism from the language movements and so forth. And obviously there's a reason for that, is because the indigenous movements do have a different perspective from a lot of white Westerners who see there's nature over here on one side, and then there's human beings over here on one side, and they're fighting with each other, and the humans are taking the nature and all that whole picture, which has come down to us for hundreds of years. That's fighting that picture is an integral part of the indigenous movements here, and one of the reasons I think that they're so powerful. So that's been very, very important in Ecuador and some of the other Andean countries as well. And it's a constant ferment of ideas combined with movement action and political action. And for example, a lot of the indigenous movements here have been in the forefront of criticizing these supposed leftist leaders like Rafael Correa, who former president of Ecuador, who among leftists in Europe and in a lot of the North, there's still this temptation, to believe in leaders like Correa, who are basically, offering neoliberalism a new face, extractivism a new face, and to try to say, oh, well, they're leftists, so they must be better than what was before. They must be, but we must support Correa. We must, and this is a real problem for like indigenous-based movements in Ecuador getting together with sympathetic left people in Europe and so forth, because the people in Europe are just not understanding the complexity and the problems with supporting a supposedly leftist pink tide kind of leader in Ecuador. But it's not only the indigenous movements that are really creative here. I mean, it's also the alliances with, for example, ecofeminist movements. I mean, there's very important ecofeminist movements at the forefront of different kinds of action, at the forefront of different kinds of thinking here in Ecuador. Labor movements and so forth. So it's a very interesting situation, and I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that people here, especially some of the ecofeminists, have been very interested in getting into closer connection with the Kurdish movements. And just recently, just a month or two ago, there was there's an interesting webinar where finally organized by some of the ecofeminists here, which brought together people speaking about patriarchy and racism from Ecuador, from Latin America, from North America, and from Kurdistan. And I think people. I think the hope is that there'll be closer connections in the future and mutual visits and more fruitful exchanges in the future.
Well, it sounds like on the ground there is something like a pattern, a democratic confederal pattern of movements happening with ecofeminist and indigenous and labor movements somehow all converging. Very interesting, and hopefully those ties of solidarity, as you say, will get stronger and stronger. The last thing I wanted you to mention a little bit, I know that you've been working with the Corner House, just for people in Peace in Kurdistan, just to understand a little bit more about the importance of the work that you guys do.
Well, I don't know if it's important. I mean, we're only 3 people, but we do try to establish and help to make it possible for different kinds of movements and different kinds of thinking to get together in a very limited way. And I mean, just as an example, I guess I could cite the work of one of my colleagues, Nick Hildyard, who's always been in close touch with Estella Schmidt in London, who works with Kurdish movements, and he's been involved. He's been involved in dialogues and in research work about For example, dams in Turkey, for example, energy in the Middle East. And the idea is always, to get people together and to have, to just to help build the conditions in which new questions can be asked, and different kinds of movement alliances can be built. And as with everything else, we don't really make a divide between so-called conceptual work and so-called movement work. I mean, all of our work actually comes out of movement problems in one sense or another. I mean, Nick has always been involved in research work and in movement work against large hydroelectric dams, and in support of local movements who are questioning these huge hydroelectric developments in different countries. And this has driven a lot of his research in this respect. And we've always, our research on energy, for example, comes out of the questions that are asked of us and asked of other people, by social movements who are actually, engaged every day with these questions as a matter of survival sometimes. So we've never really drawn a hard and fast line between conceptual work and movement work. And by the same token, I mean, when we see something, that we think might be useful in a movement sense, like, for example, the example of looking at the concepts of energy and the official concept of climate in a different way. I mean, we try to develop that and see what happens, and see if it can make new connections. But our idea is always to ground what research work we do, or what so-called conceptual work we do in these movement issues. And I think my own work, I started doing research on tree plantations because when I was working in Thailand, I mean, this was a huge issue of subsistence and survival, the land seizures by companies and by the state to take over land to plant industrial tree plantations. Similarly with climate, I mean, my involvement in the climate movements doesn't come out of studying climatology for 10 years and then trying to apply it. Quite the reverse. It comes out of things exactly like the tree plantation issue, where official climatology and official climate policy were encouraging the takeover of still more land to plant trees, industrial trees, in order to absorb carbon dioxide. This was the origin of my interest in climate and in studying the conceptual issues involved in climate, because I realized that connected with these issues of colonialism and patriarchy and racialized takeovers of land and so forth. These are all connected with the sciences of climatology, for one thing. I mean, the encouragement that climatology gives to people who say that, oh well, if it's a problem of carbon dioxide molecules, let's just take over everybody's land and plant trees and pump it all underground and all of that stuff. I mean, and movements. I mean, social movements always know that this is a disaster, and if you take them seriously, and if you understand, the point of view of the social movements who are fighting this sort of stuff, you're going to be led into going back and studying things like, well, how did climatology develop this strange perspective about what the climate is, and how can it be challenged and forced into dialogue, and how can that climatology be changed, and so forth.
Yeah. Well, very powerful perspective. And like I said, very important work that you guys are doing. Thank you very much for taking your time to share with us some of your thoughts. I think that there's a lot of convergence between the way that you guys approach things and the sort of democratic and federal paradigm that people in the Kurdish movement are struggling to articulate. And so it's great to be in contact, and hopefully we'll continue this conversation.
Yeah, that would be great. That's the whole idea.
Yeah. Thank you. Here, I'm going to stop recording.
Sure. Thank you.